Hey, Jimbo, are you ready for this deal?
Turn him out.
You bet I am. Yeah.
Yeah, Jim's ready too.
Old stories like long lost friends, rodeos and late night bends, history before our time, round pens and pasture rides, cowboys of the Osage.
Howdy, friends and neighbors. Time once again for the Cowboys of the Osage podcast with your host, Jimbo Snively and Cody Garnett. Now let's sing a little bit about it. Cowboys of the Osage, riding once again. Always got some time for a friend. And here they are, the Cowboys of the Osage.
Howdy, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Cowboys of the Osage podcast, brought to you by the Ben Johnson Cowboy Museum, the Buck and Flamingo Turquoise Shop, and Saucy Calf Traditional Native American Food, all located right here in historic downtown Pawhuska, Oklahoma. Hey, it's old Cody over here, and as always, I have my main man with me, Mr. Rodeo historian himself, Jimbo Snively. Good morning, Jimbo. Who are we talking to today?
Hey, Cody boy, good morning to you. It's another great day in Osage, and welcome back to Oklahoma. You've been gone for a while.
I know. We took a big old trip this last week.
Yeah, you did. I just beginning to wonder if you was ever going to come back. Yeah. Anyway, Cody, we got the great Jim Heaton with us today. He was a bareback bronc riding champion of the world in 64 and 65. He was runner-up to the all-around championship in 1968. Behind a guy by the name of Larry Mahan. And he also made the steer wrestling finals in 1969. Now, you don't see that every day, or 68. You don't see that every day, a bareback rider bulldogging steers.
No, you sure don't.
But anyway, he's member of all the Hall of Fame, Pro Rodeo Hall of Fame, the Oklahoma City Hall of Fame, even the Texas Hall of Fame. And but he's a Nebraska boy originally. But anyway, we're just tickled. And he also developed the rig, the handhold, and the bareback rigging that actually they're using today. Although his prototype was made out of metal, they're using one out of rawhide now. But he developed that, which really changed the sport because it changed the way they could use their feet.
Yeah, rawhide, they can make it about as hard as metal anymore.
Right,
like.
and lighter. But anyway, we're going to get into all that. He's got some great stories. I talked to him the other day, and he's done a lot, seen a lot, and we're going to get to all that. Jim, welcome to the Cowboys of the Osage podcast.
You bet. Thank you. Yeah, this will be fun.
Yeah, you bet. Where were you raised up at, Jim?
I was raised in Omaha, Nebraska, and in the city, and on my granddad's farm, 30 miles from Omaha, in Nebraska City. And I wanted to be a farmer before I decided I wanted to try to be a cowboy.
What made you decide to be a cowboy?
I'm not quite sure. My granddad on the farm always had horses, and I always loved horses and loved to ride. And in Omaha there, I always went to the hillside stables that was about 4 or 5 blocks away and rode horses and worked for them out there so I could ride some of those horses. And then one day my mom, she got remarried after my dad passed away in World War II, and they sent me to Cheyenne, and I was up in the grandstand watching the Cheyenne Frontier Days with my aunt, and I saw these kids riding calves, and I'm telling you, it just hit me. Boy, did I want to ride a calf. I mean, I was just, and it always stuck with me all through the high school days when I was playing sports and one thing and another, and I always thought, well, I'm going to see if I can try this. And one thing led to another, and I finally got out there in Wyoming at Cody Night Rodeos, where I ended up. It was a freaky deal. A long story how I got there, and spent 3 or 4 years learning my trade, and that's how it started.
I got Cody Night Rodeo. It's been going on for quite some time.
I mean, before World War II, they said the only time that it shut down was during World War II, and every night, all summer long. And it's a real unique deal. They come in from the Yellowstone Park and from back east and out west, and they have to stay at Cody because it's right there at the edge of the park, and they fill that town up, 20,000-30,000 people every night. And the only thing to do in town was rodeo, basically. And, wow, it was a great place to learn, let me tell you. And still is.
Right. You told me you got to see Casey Tibbs ride a bronc one time when you were a kid, I think. Where was that at? And it was kind of a unique story.
Oh, man. Yeah, well, I was, 12 or so, and knew nothing about rodeo and didn't run with anybody that knew anything about it. We were just all young kids that messed with horses. Anyway, they used to fly in from Madison Square Garden. That was the Super Bowl of the rodeo business. That's where they crowned the world champion area. And Omaha had a great little rodeo, and a lot of, they added a lot of money back then. And Leo Kramer from Montana was partners with that just bought in with Gene Autry. Anyway, they'd fly in there, and I was up there in the grandstand, hearing about those guys and trying to figure out who rode broncs better, Casey Tibbs or Bill Linderman. They were the two hot names at the time, besides Jim Shoulders and Harry Tompkins. By the way, Harry Tompkins was from New York. Anyway, all I can remember, and I had to reflect on this later on in life, is Casey came out there, and this big old horse was lumbering out through there, and he was riding him really good, I guess. Anyway, the whistle blew, and he jumps off, and that horse was still bucking, and I never really reflected on this until later on. But anyway, he ends up handing the buck rein while that horse was still bucking to the pickup man. And I used to love to tell that story about him.
So he jumped off the bronc like they do today, which not everybody did back then, and had the reins in his hand and handed it to the pickup man on the ground.
Yeah, either that or he got it after he jumped off. It was just, something that after I learned about rodeo business, I was just enamored with it.
Right.
Yeah, he was just a cat with his feet, had all kinds of athletic ability.
But he was a showman too. I mean, to do that, I'm sure the crowd just ate that up, that he could just hand the reins to the pickup man while he's standing on the ground.
Yeah, and he worked all three events, including the wild horse race. And everybody wanted to be Casey Tibbs or something,
Right.
He had all three events. He won it all. Well, he won the 6 times in the bronc riding and won the bareback riding. And I don't know if he won the bull riding or not. They said, I remember them old timers talking, they said he could really ride bulls, but he'd jump off a lot of times for some reason.
Yeah, I don't blame him.
I don't either.
But did you ever get to meet him later in life?
I did. And later in life, I'll never forget the first time after I knew what to look for. Saw him. He came out of Reno, Nevada. He drew this great horse, I guess. And anyway, and I got to see him riding, and it was just poetry in motion. Everybody just said it just looked like he was so relaxed, and he was in such time with the horse. Yeah, it was fun to watch him ride a great horse. And he had a saddle that was just, hardly any swells at all back then. And he cinched them real loose. And, it was just, he had this perfect form.
Right.
So anyway, it was fun to watch.
Well, how'd you get started? Did you just jump right into the pros, or did they have a high school division, or how'd you get started back then?
Well, I didn't really. I went to a few rodeos with a kid, Dick Plummer, in Omaha. We went to a few Iowa shows, maybe 5 or 6 of them on weekends. And I tried to ride bulls and bareback horses back then, and that was about it until I finally got my junior year. I went out to. Somebody told me that they had a great Wild West show in West Yellowstone. He said, and this guy that worked on the ranch that I was working on said, "Boy, you could learn to ride there if you wanted to." And so I just left Omaha and went up to Cody, got to Cody, and found out that they didn't have the Wild West show went busted. And they weren't going to have it that summer. And I didn't even know that they had a rodeo in Cody. So there I was stuck, and I always wanted to be a cowboy. Anyway, so before the rodeo started, I was there early, and I remember I'd go out to the ranch to try to get a ranch job, and I'll never forget the foreman said, "Well, have you got a saddle?" And I said no, and he said, "Well, can you shoe horses?" And I said no, and he said, "Well, we got a hay ranch up on Southwood, so maybe you can get a job up there." And that's where I ended up all summer in the hay again, just like the farm.
Right.
Well, that's some bad luck to end up in the hayfield up there.
In the summertime.
Yeah, but I got to go every night to the night rodeo. $3 entrance fee, and it cost me $1 a gas, $1 to get back and forth for gas at the ranch, and I made $6 a day of room and board, and it was just perfect place to roam.
Well, you were telling me you were part of kind of the young breed of bareback riders that started out using, spurring, using your feet kind of wild. Tell me all about that and how that came about.
Well, see, I was in the late 50s, so I got to see all them great cowboys from the 50s. The Jim Shoulders and the Casey Tibbs and on and on and on. The bareback riders, this Eddie Acreage, who was just a fabulous athlete, and Jack Bushbaum, and on and on. Anyway, so it was the way they were riding back then. It was what they call the slang was cold turkey. You just held on to this soft rigging, and it was just a handle that had a little give, and they liked that give because it got away from all this power and jerk of a horse.
Right.
And but them horses would jerk your hand right out of that rig, and the power just opened it up. So as things evolved, those guys started finding better ways to hold on besides just strength. And the first thing that us kids realized when we were learning this, they were they had real light gloves back then, but they'd put their little teeny finger and they'd stretch it out and tuck it under the rigging. And that way that was the first finger to usually go when it jerked it out. Anyway, they were doing that. And as I was learning, the only thing that bothered me after I learned how to keep my balance was my hand kept coming out. And so we learned from them other guys, started putting our little finger in. And there was a bunch of us, the Mayos from Iowa. They didn't know much more about cowboying than I did. And we all started, putting our hand in with a little pinky. And it pretty soon, this great cowboy that got killed early, Bert Trance, started doing a lot of innovative things with the rigging, because those handholds would get real loose after a while, just 2 pieces of rawhide and some leather. And he started, and once you got them shaped just like you liked them, you just hated to throw it away and start all over again. And it was quite a process. So they started cutting the stitches and putting fiberglass in there. And then it was just like a brand new handhold. So us kids followed them. And instead of, pretty soon we started putting 2 or 3 fingers in there instead of just one little finger underneath the handhold. And pretty soon we couldn't open our hands. We were stuck in there. And if you buck off, you'd hang up. So pretty soon I was one of the first guys to come up with a ripcord. So by that time I had all 4 fingers under the handle, and the only way I could get my hand out was to pry it open with my other hand. So we had a ripcord. We sewed a string in there, and we ripped it off. Well, the shoulders and all them old timers could see, and us kids could get wilder with our feet because we could hold on and we'd lean back more,
right.
and we could really get wild. We were beating their ass, but they were riding in a whole different style and really had a lot of talent and rode the horses. Anyway, we battled it back and forth. So they outlawed that. That's the first thing they outlawed. And back then, they actually, some of them guys in the 50s, they used to take tape and put it around the rigging and reverse it where it was really, really sticky and do anything to keep their hand in. Well, anyway, so they outlawed that, and I'll never forget it. And that was the year I joined in 61. And so all that spring, I didn't go to rodeos because I couldn't win unless my hand was tied in. And I couldn't tie my hand in anymore because they outlawed it. But finally, I couldn't stand anymore, and I went to a couple rodeos, and I found out, well, all the old-timers were still putting their hands in like they did the old way. They weren't paying any attention to those rules. But the contractors had a lot of power back then, and they wanted to keep the event like it was, and they weren't so they weren't so impressed with us young kids riding the way we did for some reason. Anyway, so anyway, we came up with another gimmick. I was real good about stealing gimmicks from other people or figuring out something because I could not ride in. There was a bunch of us, the males and the Van Voorhises. We all learned to ride with having our hands tucked in there.
Right.
So anyway, we came up with what we called a wedge. We put a deal underneath our knuckles, and by that time we started making our handholds a better shape, which was with more deals. But then they outlawed the wedge, so that was the second thing they outlawed on me.
You must have been beating them for them to keep outlawing it.
Yeah. So then we came up with and by that time we it goes on and on how we finally, one thing led to another, but we finally shaped these handholds and we got a thicker glove, and we had a big roll in the glove, and between that and anyway, it wedged it in there really good, just like it is, almost like it is today, only it took a lot longer to do it than they do today. And then after we were all tied in the 60s, all us guys, the males, he won 2 championships. I won a couple. Clyde Van Voorhis won a couple, and there was a couple other guys that in between that won some that were all tied in, and just like they are today. Only we didn't lean back quite as much. And then all of a sudden, somebody, I don't even know, because I was out of the, by then I was out of the, I retired in 69, and I was out of it, and it evolved to where them guys started making the riggings where they were really, really back. They really leaned back, even farther than we did. And, and it was a whole different kind of style. And their hands now are, the Barstow Rodeo Company that I sold to, my equipment company, has innovated all kinds of real neat little ways to hold on that are a lot easier, but really have their hands in it. And if you notice, they can't even get it out when the whistle blows. And if they buck off, they hang up big time. So kind of, I could go on and on, but you'll get tired of it.
Well, not really. But so you actually had invented it, and you actually sold it. I mean,
well, yeah. So this is interesting. So we had a bulldogging camp in Burke Burnett, Texas, and every fall we'd stay down there off and on while we were rodeoing and practice. And for some reason, Wichita Falls, Texas, all these there's a lot of geniuses down there, mechanical geniuses in Texas, I found out. And every time we had to do something, build something for the rodeo, like a mechanical bull or something, somebody could figure out how to do it. And this one guy, they called him Round Boy, big guy. And he was a mechanical genius, and he got to watching me put all this fiberglass in these handholds all the time. And I was having to do it for Clyde and a couple other guys and myself all the time. And he got to what he said one day. He said, Houston, you ought to make them out of aluminum. And he knew nothing about rodeo. I don't know if he ever even saw a bareback rider. And I thought, well, that's probably about right. And I never said anything, but just thought, well, that's probably the dumbest thing I ever heard anybody say. But I did say, well, they're not strong enough. He said, well, they can make that aluminum pretty strong. And so after I don't know, it took me a month or so before it finally dawned on me one day of putting all that rawhide, that fiberglass in there. I said, well, what do you think about that? And he said, well, but you got to make a pattern. So I made 2 exact patterns of my handhold, which are basically the same as they're doing today, the same style. And I made a left and a right, and a big one and a small one for a smaller hand and one. And so we got them done, and he said, well, we'll just go down there and make the pattern now. So we went down to Houston, to Dallas, and this pattern maker, and which I didn't even know what he was talking about really. But anyway, it was going to be something like $10,000 to make these patterns. And Bill, Round Boy, he says, well, there's this guy in Wichita Falls that works for a pattern maker, and he's got a little mowing paw shop, and he does some little things, and maybe he can do something. And he ends up making them for $25 a piece. And so, well, then we went back down there to Dallas to get them molded out of aluminum, and it was going to be some god-awful $20,000 and so much, like $1,000 a piece to make them. And he said, well, this guy's got a little sand casting business on the side, and maybe he can make them. And so this guy, he ends up making these for $20 a piece. We sold them for $50, and it was aluminum, and it was the same basic pattern as it is today. And you never had to have another one. And then you could put leather around it to make it fit just perfect. So that was the story of that until they outlawed them. Then they outlawed them.
Who outlawed them then?
Well, that's another big, long story. and so the way that went is because I was winning, they put me on the board of the PRCA, and which I shouldn't have been on because I was dumber than a post about politics. But this Cotton Rosser, who was a famous stock contractor, they had all the rodeos in California and in Idaho and one thing another. Was just they were getting a lot of scat about not bucking anybody off with these new handholds. We were really tied in, and we were hanging up, and they couldn't get off of the off the pickup man, and so and they were getting a lot of humane problems with the calf being jerked down. And so he had all these committees. He had 80 rodeos a year himself. Sometimes you're putting on 2 a week. And anyway, so he came to me. He says, I got all our committees, and if you guys don't outlaw Houston, if you don't outlaw those aluminum handholds, and Dale Smith, who was the president of the Cap Roper and a strong president, and never gave anything to anybody about rule changes or one thing or another. And they pretty much left it up to us individual event people about how to change things. Anyway, he said, Cotton says, well, you got to quit jerking these calves down. We're getting too much slack. It looks too bad. And, and if you knew anything about calf roping, you knew it really didn't hurt them any. But it didn't look good. So we sat around there for 4 or 5 days trying to figure out a way around this deal. And Cotton Ross, we had one more day. And so we were at a stalemate. And I knew Dale wasn't going to give. But for some reason, I was just fed up. And I said, but I knew Dale wasn't going to give, so I wasn't worried about it. I said, Dale, if you'll give up the calf jerking, I'll give up the iron handle. And Dale says, you got a deal, Houston. And there I was making money with this deal, not a big, but and that was the end of that. What they didn't realize is I had a shop going by that time, and I had this famous Ed Campos, who was an S.D. Myers, learned how to. He was just a genius with leather, and I told him what happened, and he was the one that said, "Well, we could do the same thing, make them that hard out of rawhide." And he was the one that showed us how to make them out of rawhide, which they're doing today. And then the Barstows just kept, when we sold it to them, they kept inventing better ways to do it, and it's gotten. I don't even know how they do it today. It's gotten so complicated.
Hey, Jimbo.
Am I going on?
You want Cody?
You know, there was a guy from right here in Pawhuska that ended up owning the S.D. Meyer Saddle Company down in El Paso. An Osage Indian right here in Pawhuska ended up owning it there at the last.
Really?
The last when it was open. Yes, sir.
Oh,
Small world out there.
Yeah.
Isn't it so? Yeah.
Boy, that's some rodeo history, though, Cody. All that the handhold and how it all started and developed it.
To this day, some of them bareback riders at the national finals, you can see it takes them a couple laps to get with the pickup man following to get their hand out of the riggings.
Yeah,
to this day.
And I, because I'm so far out of it, and they wouldn't listen to me anyway. But what I really found out is, and it took me years before I had confidence to do this, is you really don't need your hand in that good at the top, your top finger, because the give is in the back. That's where you get jerked out, and so you can actually loosen it up in the front and get out real easy, and still be, after you learn to ride, you'll still never come off. They'll never jerk your hand out of the rigging, but they don't do that. They for some reason they haven't figured that one out, and the stock contractors have no power anymore, and so it's really kind of hard on the bareback horses running around, while they're trying to get their hands out. But that's the way it is, and it'll evolve one way or the other.
Did you do any much saddle bronc riding, Jim?
I tried. I really tried, but I never did. I never knew the theory really. And I ran with Bill Smith, and I started at Cody, Wyoming together. He was from that town. And
great bronc rider, Bill Smith.
Yeah,
he's got a book out too.
You bet. Yeah. And anyway, we traveled together when we're filling our permits and one thing and another. And there's some stories about gimmicks and how to ride saddle broncs by being tied in just like in the bareback rigging. I don't know if you want to get into that. That's a whole nother story. Yeah. Bill Smith could do that better than mine.
Yeah, tell us about it. You were telling me something about glue on the saddle too. I'd never heard of that.
Well, yeah, there's this famous amateur bronc rider that everybody was trying to figure out how he was so great. Larry Kane from Montana, and he was just great talent. But he started making the swells in the saddle a lot bigger, and he started making the saddle pick up higher, and basically a whole new style. And besides him being so talented, he had glue. Now, this wasn't just a little bit of glue. This was the belt dressing they used to put on those big tractors where the belts where they combine, where they chuck the corn. Well, we didn't know what kind of glue he was using, but all us kids were trying to figure it out. And that was kind of a kept secret with him. And him and Aaron Pursley, another guy that he had, they had all these gimmicks. And so anyway, I got the saddle fixed up and got Bill fixed up, and we did everything, but we couldn't. But the final thing was this glue. We couldn't figure. Every time we had some kind of glue, we'd be in there. It was just good enough to be in there, but if a horse really jerked you, it'd pop you out like a cannon. So it didn't work. And because Bill could really ride, it didn't bother him. But me, I'd just buck off. But anyway, this is kind of a funny story. It goes on and on. Anyway, I went home for Christmas and I came back. Bill says, I found out what the glue is. And it was that belt dressing. And so what you did is you had to reinforce your chaps. It was so strong. And then you put it on your swells of your saddle and a little on and then you tightened up your binds to boot, which gets a little technical, but you were just locked in. I mean, you didn't even need the buck rein. And Bill and I were out there in Nebraska going to them amateur rodeos, and I'll never forget the first time I really got through a horse with it. And he went out there and really bucked it, and all of a sudden there I was, glued in there. I won the bronc riding, and Bill Smith didn't even. I guess he probably won't say because he was a great bronc rider. Anyway, after that he said, Houston, I've had it. He said, I don't care if you beat me every day. He said, but I'm quitting them gimmicks. It's hurting my legs, and I can't ride very good like that anyway. So that was that. He went back to winning like he always did. And I actually joined the association that 69, Bill and I, and I was riding broncs. And when I drove a decent bronc, I could place in the pros. And I'll never forget, I drew this horse that was supposed to be hard to ride and nobody could ever win on. And I rode him, I thought I rode him good. This famous bronc rider, Jim Tesher, has been around and just famous bronc rider. Great whole family. Anyway, I'll never forget him coming up to me and said, Houston, that's the best I ever seen that horse rode. And I was really tickled, but I knew I was riding with these gimmicks. And so as I was getting ready to ride the next horse, he was up there, and he probably, I didn't know this until later on, but anyway, he noticed all that. In that spring, to his credit, he had all them gimmicks outlawed, and they went back to riding like they, the old days,
right?
Which saved the bronc riding because that bronc, you were so tied in that Larry Kane's running mate that had all that gimmicks in Sydney, Iowa. A horse fell on him and he couldn't get out, and it broke that thigh bone so bad that he never could ride again. It was really dangerous.
Right.
So a lot of people don't realize that.
I'd never heard of it.
I think that's what they're doing now again, Jimbo. I heard they're basically gluing themselves in again. I've
heard that, but it can't be that good because the glue can't be that good because I noticed that if they get a little loose, they pop out.
They say they're using a rosin to keep themselves in now.
Well, the rosin is the old style, but they can use some kind of little glue. And as long as the horse doesn't have any power, it's really good. But it's a different style of riding than the old days. If you'll notice, they get way up on the neck, but their feet, their legs aren't straight, all the way. They're kind of still, their knee is still a little bit crooked. And in the old days, if you'll watch Casey Tibbs and some of them great bronc riders, when they got up in their neck, their knees were completely straight, and it just looked a lot better.
I think that they moved the D-rings back, too, on these new saddles. Made the swells real high and moved the D-rings back. It's a totally different saddle than what they used to ride. My first cousin is Wyatt Casper's father-in-law, and we got a big conversation about that the other day.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing. It's a whole different style, but it's still, the bronc riding is still great because they do buck them off, you know. And the thing about the bareback riding is they just don't hardly buck them off. You know, it is this new style is really, if they've got ride a horse with them, what they call the eliminator pin, the really strong horses, and there's not a lot of them, but they have a hell of a time riding them. They can't. It's just that style doesn't with all that power doesn't permit it. In my day, there's a couple famous. This one famous horse called Come Apart won the Horse of the Year. He was about 16, weighed about 1,600, and looked like a quarter horse. And he had so much power and such that the famous bronc rider Dennis Reiners, when he was tied in, split him right down the wishbone. He rode him, but it broke him. And in the finals, one of my second to last horse, when I was contesting with trying to win the world with Paul Mayle, I drew him and I was tied in really good, and he had a good day, and I rode him, but he cracked my ribs while I rode him. That's how strong he was.
What about that horse they have that they just retired? Old Killer Bees. What'd you think about it?
You're over my head there. I don't follow him all that close.
Oh, okay. It was a bad dude. That's all I'm going to say.
What's that?
I said it was one of the few bucking horses that you see nowadays that people actually knew the name of it, and they everybody took notice when they bucked old Killer Bees. I think they just retired her.
Yeah.
She was a bad dude.
Other thing. Yeah, some of them great horses, like that Come Apart, lasted for 10 years, you know, every year, and he never quit bucking. And that's what makes a famous horse. But the sport's doing good, all that TV, and there's a lot of enthusiasm out there, and it just keeps evolving.
Oh, yeah. There's a legend up Burwell, Nebraska about you riding a bareback horse into the stands. What's the story on that, Jim?
Well, this was interesting. Casey Tibbs just came off of a movie, and in that movie he corralled a bunch of wild horses, and I don't know what he did with them because we were out rodeoing, but anyway, it got a lot of publicity, and he started bringing them into a few rodeos, and he brought them into Burwell, and I drew one of them, and they were just wild horses. I don't think they'd ever
Born to Buck. That was the name of the movie.
Yeah. That was it. And I don't know if they'd ever even been in the arena and drawn on it. Anyway, I drew one. This son buck ran out there full blast in the middle of the arena and then jumped 20 foot in the air, came down and run right straight into the wood fence and the wood fence was right next to the grandstand, and he crashed through that wood fence, and I guess I just jumped off and sat in the grandstand for a second or so. And the other day when I was up there, they remembered that. I couldn't remember. I remembered it, but I didn't know anybody else would have.
You know, that old Burwell Rodeo grounds, it's still pretty much just the same as it was when you were riding, I think.
Yeah, that's what, and I never really analyzed it before until when I was up there, and it's really a unique design, and I was amazed. It was just a really neat design and a great they had a brand new grandstand, and my God, every night it was full. It was really something.
You ever been up there, Jimbo?
No, I've seen a lot of pictures of it.
I tell you what, the rope and chute comes out on the left side of the arena, and you're not very far from that left fence. But you know how far you are from that right fence? Forever.
Looks like a long way.
Forever.
Yeah.
I roped there probably 10 years in a row, and I never scratched there, and I said, hell, I'm never going back there. Yeah, I entered one other time, and I ended up placing there 4 or 5 times in a row after that. But if a steer goes right, you're screwed.
Yeah.
There ain't no winning on anything like when it goes right there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the other thing that they've shortened these barriers to where they rope them real quick, and it makes it for a faster rodeo and at faster times. But the other side doesn't get to see it, as much. In my day, it seemed like in the '60s the barriers were a lot longer. You'd run your cattle way out there before you got off or roped them. Anyway, that's my opinion.
Yeah, one time they had a 20-foot score there, Jimbo, and they had a neck rope. They wasn't hand pulling a 20-foot score. They had a neck rope, and the guy put that neck rope on wrong, and it came back and wrapped around my dad's neck. And somehow he got his horse stopped right before it all came tight, but it was that old yellow nylon rope stuff. Well, it was all old and dry rotted, and my dad had splinters from that rope all around his whole neck. Yeah. It was pretty wild. It was pretty wild. That's the longest neck rope I've ever seen anybody use, though. 20-foot neck rope. Just asking for trouble on that deal.
Wow.
Yeah. They probably learned the hard way on that one, huh?
I think so. About didn't have a dad after that one.
Yeah.
Did you rodeo at the NFR in Los Angeles your first year or two, Jim?
They had the first, I think in '62, they still had this famous Los Angeles rodeo in a football field. And that was the last year that I'd ever remember going to Los Angeles.
But did they not have the NFR there?
Yeah, in '64 when you won it, had to be in Los Angeles.
Well, I don't think that they had that. I think it was just that one year that I remember. It was, and they'd have it every year, but that was it. Just kind of died out, I guess. That I remember, but I don't remember ever going back except that one year.
Huh.
In Los Angeles. So you got me on that one.
Yeah.
When you won the world in 1964, it wasn't in Los Angeles.
No, it was in Oklahoma City. Yeah, see, my first year that I went to the finals was in L.A. That was the second or third year that they tried it, in Dallas twice.
Right.
And it didn't work. And then they moved to L.A. for 1 year. And that was in '62. And in '63, I broke my arm there in the finals in '62. And in '63, I didn't get started till the middle of the season. In '64, yeah, that was Oklahoma City. Yeah, I was in Oklahoma. I never did go to Vegas. I retired before Vegas.
One of your sidekicks, a great bareback rider, was Clyde Van Voorhis. He was quite a character, wasn't he?
Of all the characters that I've ever heard of or mentioned, he's the outstanding of them. And somebody needs to write a book about all of this stuff.
I've seen pictures of him and at a rodeo with 2 black eyes, and stuff. He was all the time getting a black eye.
Oh, man. I'm telling you, he'd get in fights all the time. And sometimes he'd win them and sometimes he wouldn't. But he'd get to drinking, and he'd get to chewing somebody out about something that bugged him or one thing or another. And he could chew somebody out like nobody else could. He used to always I'll never forget the year that him and I were going head and head for the year. And he fell in love with this barrel racer, Kay Van Voorhis. And he was just traveling with her and beating our hinds in, still winning, he's still about $6,000 or $7,000 ahead of us and going to about half the rodeos we were going to. And we were at Colorado Springs, the state fair, and we come up there, and him and I were real close, and he used to love to harass me about things, and because I was about half dude compared to him. Anyway, he'd say, okay, Houston, you're going to go to 85 rodeos this year, and I'm going to go to 60, and it looks like I'm going to still beat your ass. And he did, and he was supposed to. He was just riding unbelievable when he topped out here, you know, and he rode, you know, he could ride anything better than anybody at that time. So anyway,
I think he went. Didn't he go to Japan with Ben John or with Casey Tibbs and that bunch?
Oh, yeah, him and Paul May went to Casey Tibbs.
I bet that's a mess.
Yeah, well, I heard they actually got kicked out because they got to harassing. They did something, I don't know. They got to drinking and did something to insult the Japanese. They got kicked out. I'll never forget. You know, in Casey, because he was a stunt man, he used to pretend he was drunk, and Clyde said he could get on the top of the stairs and roll all the way down and not get hurt and jump back up. Just things like, and then they'd get drunk in the bar with those little cocktail glasses, and Clyde could do this. They chew that glass up to the stem. Blood's running down their cheeks. They'd spit that glass out or swallow it or something. You know, it was just, you know, things you wouldn't even believe anybody could do.
Them bareback riders are crazy.
Yeah, and throw in Casey Tibbs.
Yeah, I could go on and on.
What was the story about him getting in trouble at Oklahoma City with the policemen, the cops?
You want to hear that?
Yeah, I want to hear that. That's a pretty good story.
Well, so Clyde he retired finally, and they let him judge the finals. And after the and before the finals, they had a big reception, and he got pretty tipsy. And when he got tipsy, let me tell you what, it's hard telling what he did. It was a show to watch. You knew something was going to happen usually. Anyway, so instead of opening the door like a normal person would when the party was over, he just kind of took it. I guess I didn't see this, but I heard the story. He just knocked the door open with his foot and flung it all open, and it crashed. And there happened to be some policemen in the hall, and they say, "Hey, man," and shoot him out about being goofy. And Clyde, being Clyde, decided to put those policemen in their place, and he'd go on. He said, "You $2 sons of bitches, I could buy you and sell you for nothing," and on like he could do. And I mean, when he got done with it, you were melted. You were welded. And so that was that. And the finals was over, and they had another reception. And he got drunk again. And when he went out to leave, there the cops was. And I guess he said something to him again. And he saw that they were coming at him. And so he saw the handwriting on it. He started running, thought he could get away. And they caught him. And they just beat the hell out of him. I mean, and they got pictures of it, and a lot of guys saw it. Alan Keller was one of the main ones. And so one thing led to another. Somebody finally said, "Well, you ought to sue him for all that, Clyde." And finally, one thing came to another, and I think Kay made him finally go up there and file a lawsuit. So he got this famous young lawyer that was going to do it on a contingency. And something like $10 million. They're just killing poor old Clyde that didn't deserve this, you know, because he was innocent as day is long, naturally. And in the meantime, Alan Keller, being this Alan Keller, you probably knew as much about him as I do. He was a big, tough son of a buck and famous for for all kinds of things himself. Anyway, he said, Clyde, if you give me, so it was, $10 million was the lawsuit. And if you give me a million out of that deal, I'll make sure that jury makes sure that you're innocent. And so anyway, Clyde and I were producing the Cody Night Rodeo at the time, and in the wintertime, he was flying back and forth with that lawyer and trying to get things ready. And finally, it came to trial, and he flew down there, and it was a couple of days. Anyway, he flew back, and he was hacking and gagging. He was in a badass mood, kind of. And finally, I said, "What in the hell's wrong, Clyde?" And he said, "Well, we won the case." And then I said, "Oh man!" And he said, "But yeah, that friggin' lawyer, he settled for $10,000 or $5,000, and now he's famous because he's won the only case that ever against the police that's ever been filed, and he's famous now. And I've got that much money in plane tickets, and besides that, Alan Keller thinks I owe him $100,000." and this Alan Keller actually thought Clyde owed him that. He thought he was trying to screw Clyde out. Clyde thought Alan thought Clyde was trying to screw him out of the money. So he was, as they were going to these rodeos together, they all rodeo. Clyde kept, this Alan Keller was a bad son of a buck and tougher than nails. He had to run from Alan from rodeo to rodeo till Alan finally saw the light of day, and that was the end of that.
Oh, man.
And that's just, and I could go on and on. I could tell you 2 or 3 that you didn't even want to hear, and I wish somebody would write them all down.
Well, you said something about one time you all hauled this bulldogger, and he caught his car on fire or something. What was that all about?
Oh man, this is another Clyde Van Voorhis story. It's probably as good as this other one. So anyway, in the 4th of July, everybody back then they all had Sean and Mahan, and there's about Bobby Berger. They all had airplanes because gas was cheap. Bill Cornell, and we were all going to 2 or 3 rodeos during the 4th of July. And Clyde and I happened to be traveling together during the 4th. And we were at Bellfouche and Mulbridge. And you could just barely make them from day to night if you drove on 90 miles an hour. And for some reason, I must have left my car somewhere else and flew in there. And Clyde and I were looking for a ride to Mulbridge, and pretty soon he comes to me. He said, "Joe Chase wants to talk to you." And a big, tough, great cowboy, Indian cowboy that they put in the Hall of Fame, rode broncs and bareback horses. And for some reason, he couldn't get to Mulbridge because he was in the bronc riding, but he needed his car up there, and he had a brand new Buick. And he said, "Houston, you need a ride? You take my car up there." And I said, "Yeah, that's great, thanks." And so I told Clyde, and pretty soon Clyde comes. He said, "Houston, there's this old timer that's a great guy, but he's been drinking, and he's a bulldogger. Needs to ride up there at Mulbridge." So as soon as I got through bulldogging, we jumped in the car and threw him in the back seat. He was pretty drunk. He smoked, by the way. And we got going. Pretty soon we smelled that cigarette smoke, and we kept looking. Oh, God dang, that seat must be. It looked like the seat was smoking. So we kept driving and couldn't find any water. So anyway, finally we just couldn't take it anymore, and we stopped and threw him out and took the seat and thought we had the seat out. Took the seat out and tried to get the fire out and thought we had it out. Threw him back in, the seat in, threw him back in. Got there, rode our broncs, and as we were coming back from from bareback riding. Pete Crump by that, or Fredericks by that time had got there and had saw his car, and in the meantime, the car had burnt completely up inside. It was one mad Indian, and the first guy he saw was Van Voorhis, and he gave it to Van Voorhis. His son was blah blah blah, and Clyde being Clyde, you dumb big friggin' Indian. That wasn't my deal. That was Houston's deal. And so if you wanna get on somebody, get on Houston. And I never did. I don't know what happened, but I never did hear from Joe. And I guess he had insurance or something, but I never did. That was the end of that. But pretty soon the word got out that Joe was insulted just about too much with Clyde. And so the word got out that Joe wanted a little piece of Clyde's ass. And as we were working our way up to Calgary, through 2 or 3 rodeos, Clyde just kept dodging Pete that was looking for him. The word was out. So when we get to Calgary, they put us up in this big old hotel up in the top floor, the 12th floor, with this huge auditorium with about 6 or 7 beds for two of us to sleep at a time. There's probably 12 of us in there. I would happen to be sleeping with John, and it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and all the drunks were coming in, but we were asleep. Anyway, finally, here comes Clyde in there and waking everybody up. And about 5 minutes later, here comes Joe, and they had a toe-to-toe fight like you couldn't believe. It was, and we were all, everybody was watching. And pretty soon, Pete got Clyde behind the neck and was choking him down, and Clyde was turning blue. And because Sean Davis was always kind of the leader, and Sean says, "Okay, Pete, you've made your point. You don't have to kill him." And so Pete left him up. You know, he let Clyde up, and that was the end of that. It was some fight, let me tell you.
He died young. What happened to him, Jim?
Well, he was up there at Larry Jordan's in Montana and had an aneurysm.
I'll be darned.
I don't know. He was having some. He chewed a lot, and even when he was tired, he was having some problems with his belly or stuff. And I don't know if he ever really got it taken care of, but I guess they went out to work cattle, and he was not feeling good and stayed there, and they found him in the bathtub, dead.
I'll be darned.
And I don't know exactly. Larry Jordan knows the complete story of it. If you want to ever hear about it, he could tell some Van Voorhis stories. Let me tell you.
Yeah, somebody ought to write a book on that guy. What got you started bulldogging, Jim?
Oh my God! I just fell in love with it. I don't know why, but actually, when the first time I ever started, this is kind of a freak accident. I was just learning to ride bareback horses, and the spring was coming, and I got a job working in the canyon, in this Wind River Canyon, and I got fired because my machine went down, and I took a nap, and they saw me napping and waiting for them, and anyway, they fired. And so, but the Shoshone, a one-horse town that had this Reno Long and a pro football player that I can't, the name is fit my name. He was a big, tough son of a buck that bulldogged and roped, and they were all team roping fanatics and bulldogging. They bulldogged, and I borrowed a horse from this kid that was a bronc son of a buck, I guess. I didn't anyway. He was a green horse. Anyway, they were first bringing them steers up, and I was looking at them, chomping my bit, couldn't hardly wait, and I was wrapping the reins around the wire for this horse, and he pulls back, and jerks off my second finger, just the tip of it. And oh my God, that was my riding hand. And spring was starting, and I was just figuring it out. I was ready to start winning, I thought. And I was ready to go home, Mom. I was devastated. It never hurt, and it was right there on the ground. I just picked it up and put it on the post. That was before anybody knew about trying to put it back together.
Right.
And I told the guys that I had to leave, and they're, no, God dang, it's nothing to. And they wrapped it up, and we practiced for 2 days. And finally, it started hurting, and so they took me into Riverton. The doctor, he patched it up and cut it open and everything. And so I had to switch hands. Now, I was riding with I'm a left-hander, but they told me when I started, everybody said that you got more balance if you ride with your offhand. And so that's how I started. 3 years learning to balance and one thing and another. And holy mackerel. So, and I knew what I was doing wrong, and I finally felt like I was correcting what I was doing wrong. And so I spurred a lot of bales of hay and just was obsessed with thinking. I was totally obsessed thinking about having to be hung up, because I was hanging up. By then we were holding on big time, and I was hanging up every time I bucked off, and that got to be wasn't a lot of fun. And so I developed what I used to tell a few kids, how my leverage on my hand, I pulled up in and out anyway. And I tried to visualize in my mind how I was going to correct it. And after about 4 or 5 horses, I finally, it just, all that other practice and everything came to fruition, and I started winning finally, and just bucking off and hanging up once in a while. And I was a real freak. It was a freak accident that I ever made a bareback rider, because my legs were I was tall, but I was real long in the waist, and so I developed that hanging, instead of sitting up on them horses like the great bareback riders, where they got away from all that strength and all that power of them. I'd lean back, and when you lean back, you take a lot more jerks, so you had to be tied in. But anyway, and for some reason it worked, and I don't know why. It was just a freak of nature, and everybody they were starting, the Mayos and a lot of other great bareback riders were starting to kind of do the same thing, because it was just natural with your hand tied in that you could get back, and we could beat them young guys. The great guy like Shoulders and Harry Tompkins and Jack Bushbaum, my God, and they never did change. They kept on their old style, and so we just kept going back and forth with the rules, and it finally went our way. Whether that's better or worse, I don't know. That'll be for the historians to figure out.
Why'd you retire, Jim, when you did?
Well, I retired a little. I got heavy. I got about another 10 pounds heavy. And the horses in that era, the late 60s, started to just, all the big horses, which there was a lot of big, strong bareback riders back in the 50s and early 60s. And they started, them big horses started disappearing. And, man, I had to have a really strong horse to handle my weight, and I was kind of hard on them. I was real hard on them, and but I could spur them and win if I had the right horse. But I went 3 or 4 years, really riding good, but I didn't draw very good, and I'd win second or in there a couple times, and had a couple years where I was really riding good, but I was in the middle of the pack trying to win. And then in 68, when I finally learned how to bulldog because of this great bulldogger, John W. Jones, I drew a lot of great horses in 1 second for the year, and 6 for the Bulldogging. But the Bulldogging story was, I just couldn't get it. I could win on a good steer, like everybody, but I was just I never did. I was a long ways from an elite bulldogger, and there was this John W. Jones. The California guys actually had a better technique than the Okies and the Texans, but the Okies and Texans were still, but their style was still great too. But this John W. Jones, who always just rodeoed in the spring, and he didn't go real strong, and always win for second or third for the year. He ended up winning the finals 4 or 5 times in a row. Anyway, it didn't make any difference what steer he had. And if he didn't even win on it, but he'd make a perfect run, and that steer would just fly, get all fours on the ground perfect. Just nail him every time, even if he'd slide him down there 10 feet. It was just phenomenal. And I just couldn't believe it. And him and I kind of jogged. And so I got to visit with him, and I got to ask him what the deal was. How come he was, I was kind of just intrigued about it, how he could do it. And he wasn't a great coach, but he kept telling me he said, you got to get the kink off of the horse. Now, I just couldn't get what he meant. What the hell do you mean? And so we had this one big practice steer. He had this one big practice steer that was, a couple of years being a bulldog. And he was real low-headed, real strong, and real big. And when you went to catch him, instead of slowing down, he sped up. So you really had to drive up there and catch him perfect. And John W., he didn't, by then, the only time he practiced was in his head. It was all a head game with him. But the Okies are all the California guys were the ones that kind of invented shoot dogging. And they'd practice out of the chute, and slide and practice their technique. So anyway, we got to look at these 8mm films, and I'd say, well, what do you mean by the kink? And he said, see what I'm doing off the horse. And I couldn't understand what he was talking about. I just couldn't see it. I didn't know what he meant by the way he got off on the horse and got his arms around that steer's horns. Because I was still it looked like I was doing the same thing. And so I said, well, let me see you throw this steer out of the chute. And this steer slid him about 10 feet. He was a strong son of a buck. And he just wiped him out. And so I got in there, and this steer just threw me around like I never bulldogged again. And I tried him again, and still. Finally, John, for some reason, got a little pissed at me being so ignorant. And he gets in the chute with me, and he says, this is what I mean by getting your kink on the chute. And he showed me how you grab that horn. When you're grabbing that horn off the chute, you got to twist it a certain way instead of just, it's kind of, it's real technical, locking. And because I bulldogged and practiced so much, I understood what he meant. And after a year, 6 or 7 months, I finally had a technique that really, really worked. And I was really, really winning with the technique. And not a lot of guys knew this technique. And if they did, they didn't understand it like me. So that's the story. Getting too carried away.
I think I heard Alan Keller say one time that John W. Jones was the best bulldogger he ever saw.
Oh, he was just phenomenal, and everybody thought because he was pretty big and strong to boot, but it was his technique. He ended up he had a kid that ended up winning the Bulldogging 2 or 3 times that was just half his size because he had this great technique.
You know, the
Tommy
Myers
Career,
has taught a
yeah.
technique similar to that. Butch Myers did, that where a small guy could throw a steer easier, just as easy as a big guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was, and even today, they don't do it a lot. They don't understand it. A lot of them guys. I forget the name of the guy that won the world in Nebraska.
Gorsuch.
We got to visit.
Dean Gorsh.
We got to visit, and I got to tell him my story, and he got to tell him. He said, "I finally learned the right technique. It took me 10 years, but I finally learned it and ended up winning it."
Yep.
I got another little story. This young kid in Burke Burnett that was only 8 or 9 years old used to watch us practice every day. And he ended up being a hell of an athlete and a football star and everything from Burke Burnett, Texas. And he'd watch us every day for years. And when I learned, I showed him this technique, and he was a natural athlete and a great bulldogger at the time. And I showed him this thing. He ends up winning the world that year with that technique.
Who was it?
Rick Bradley.
Oh,
Rick
yeah.
Bradley.
I read his name a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was, and he never did really go again after he won it. There's very little money on it, but if it fits your personality, it was just so much fun. We used to run 20 steers a day, practicing. It was just, and I never did understand why more calf ropers don't bulldog, because it's a freak if you get hurt, But it looks like your knees would get hurt. And back in my day, there was a lot of calf rovers that bulldog. Not a lot of them, but a few of them.
Right. Dean Oliver bulldogged.
Oh my God! Yeah, he learned from John W. Jones.
Did he?
Yeah, he learned from, and when he cracked out, then after he cracked out bulldogging, he won all them all around.
Right. Tom Neesmith was another one that bulldogged real good and was a calf roper.
Yeah, and I saw him just at the last, but he must have been something.
Yeah, he wasn't. He wasn't very big either.
I heard that. Yeah, and John W. has told me who he learned from, and this was way back almost, I think, in the early 50s, and I can't remember his name, but he was a famous bulldogger.
Yeah.
That he told me. I said, "Where did you?" And he said, "Well, they said John W. Jones, Harley May, a great bulldogger who had a unique style. He said when John W. was cracked out, they used to practice on. They had team roping cattle that they trained where they could bulldog them too. Mm-hmm. And they said John W. used to practice on them, and they'd slide him 20 feet before because they were so strong with their heads. And they said it was unbelievable. He'd just wipe them out. So the only thing about that bulldogging is today that because the steers are smaller and that barrier is so short, and they've got those steers where they're a lot more even. In our day, they never even them up, and it I think unless they're fresh steers, it kind of gets it looks a little too easy, in my opinion. But
I used to clean stalls for a great bulldogger, Jimbo. Did you ever know Jim Painter?
Oh my golly, you bet I did. Yeah,
I used to clean his stall when I was a kid. Once a week, I'd go over to his house, clean his stalls, and he'd tell me stories about him and Alf Feddersen. Him and Feddersen going up and down the road. Yeah,
he was a great bulldogger, and his brother was a great bronc rider, Bill Feddersen.
Yep.
Yeah, and I talked to when I was young, and a few times we were with them old timers, and they got to telling stories, and I wasn't interested. I was thinking about riding broncs. I didn't want to hear these stories. And when you get older and reflect, you can't believe that you weren't interested. Yeah, because that Pete Crump, he picked me up. When I was having heck that second year I joined, trying to figure how to hold on. He saw some potential in me, and he used to every year pick up a bareback rider or a bronc rider and haul them around and haul them and promote them for 50% and paid all the expenses and everything. He never made any money with it, and he'd tell me them old stories, because he was in the 50s about different deals, and it was really fun to listen to.
Yeah, there was an old guy named Tater Decker. He'd come sit around there because he lived down there by us in that area.
Yep.
And, I wish I'd have paid way more attention.
Yeah.
I just took it for granted that, I was always going to be cleaning Jim Painter's stall, and I was always going to know Tater Decker, and, and just a lot of these great guys aren't around anymore.
Oh, I know.
Yeah. And Tater, I'll tell you a story about Tater Decker.
He was a turtle.
I didn't know him
sure.
I didn't know him when he was contesting. So he was still bulldogging a little bit, great bulldog. And I didn't know he did all them bronc riders. Back then a lot of them guys worked all the events. But he was a pickup man, great pickup man. And I'll never forget, I didn't get off one time real good because my hand was tied in. And that was when they told you when they told you something, you listened. And he said, Houston, the next time I come by and you don't get off on me, don't look for me again. And Pete Crump had already warned me. He said, when those pickup men tell you what they're going to do or what they're not going to do, you better pay attention because they can make your horse go bad or good. And and Pete said, and so I remember one time I drew this horse that was supposed to circle to the left, and he said, "Now you make sure you tell Tater to turn that horse to the circle of that horse, and then pickup men could ride in front of that horse, and then that horse sometimes would follow him, and he was one of them." And he said, "And if you win something, you go up there and give him a fifth of whiskey." And I won the go around and gave him a fifth of whiskey. That was just standard back then in the early 60s.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you wanted your horse, of course they would have done this probably anyway, but if you wanted your horse and you knew your horse was going to circle one way, you made sure that the shoot boss put him in the right hole. And if he put him in the right hole, whether he would have or not, and if he did, you gave him a fifth of whiskey if you won something. That was just standard. And I learned that from Pete Crump.
Yeah.
That's a few stories that I can remember.
Jim, if you were making a Mount Rushmore of bareback riders, who would you put on it? Need 4 names.
Well, for pure talent, back in my day, before I started in the old time style where they rode the horse as much as they did, they had Eddie Acreage won 3 championships, and I saw him ride one time, and he was kind of one-footed, I guess, but he them guys just kidding about being one-footed. But the right kind of horse, he could throw his foot completely over his head and gap completely open. And some of them old-timers could do that on the right horse. Johnny Hawkins, another great, who won the world. And some of them guys could do that. And there was 4 or 5 of them 50 guys that were just, I never did study their riding that much, except I tried to copy a couple of them. But in my day, probably the most talented of all the guys was this kid from Canada, Malcolm Jones. And the other one was Kenny Stanton from Oregon. And they rode cold turkey. They rode the old style. They weren't tied in. And they could beat your ass with their style. And Malcolm Jones won Canada 4 or 5 times, and he probably could have won the world if he'd come down here and really, tried. But and then and then at one time, after, it seems like we all peaked out at certain times. Like after I peaked out, then Paul Mayo was a fabulous bronc bareback rider, and then Clyde Van Voorhis was another one. And then I'll never forget Clyde saying, there's this young kid, this Gary Tucker kid from Arizona. He can really ride, but he didn't know how to hang on. I'm going to show him how to hang on. And he showed him how to hang on, and he beat her ass real quick. He was just and about that time I was slowing down, and I can't, I don't know. Then the last really, really talented bareback rider was Joe
Alexander.
Joe Alexander, who won 4 or 5 in a row. And the only reason he won them is because Bill Smith found out what a great talent he is, and started promoting him and making him go. and he was about my age, a year or two younger, but he didn't really start till he was about 26 years old, 27 in the pros, and then he had a god awful amount of talent and fabulous. And then from then on, I really didn't pay that much attention, but there was plenty of them that won a lot of championships.
Wow.
Well, that Bill Smith, when I was listening to his book here a while back, Jimbo, he had a severely compound fractured broken leg, and he was still getting on broncs because that's the way you were supposed to do it. That's what the old timers did. He was still getting on broncs with a broken leg, no cast or nothing.
Oh, I'm telling you, that's just the way it was. Yeah, and Bill was extremely tough. Nobody knows it, but he was, besides being an unbelievable bronc rider, he was an arm wrestler, but he didn't want to be an arm wrestler. He just did it because everybody knew he was really good, and every time somebody else thought they were great, somebody like me would come up to him and say, "Hey, you got to arm wrestle this Joe Blow because he thinks he's so great," and Bill would put him down. And Bill and Bill finally got mad at me because he said, "This is the last time I'm arm wrestling with one of your ideas about me beating kids. It's starting to hurt my riding arm." And I got to talking to him. Bill and I still talk a little bit, and I got to talking to him about his arm wrestling the other day, and this was interesting. I said, because I didn't know the whole story about all his arm wrestling. I thought I was probably the only guy that got him into all these matches. But he said, well, the only time that I had 2 times, the only time I had really trouble. He said, one time they hooked me up with Benny Reynolds. Now, Benny Reynolds was in the 50s, won the all-around. He had a hand on him of the size of most people's foot. And he was a real big man and stronger than a moose. And worked all the events, all 3 ride events and Bulldogs, and just naturally strong. Anyway, for some reason he got hooked, he said, with Benny Reynolds, who arm wrestled every now and then. And he said, that was the hardest time I ever had putting some down. Except the best story was, and I knew this one from hearing about it, they hooked him up in Canada with this bulldogger called Bud Butterfield. And Bud Butterfield probably weighed around 300 pounds and was built like a piece of boulder, like a boulder, and huge, had an arm on him like somebody's leg. And I guess he was a famous arm wrestler. And for some reason, they got him hooked up. I didn't see this, but I heard the story. They got him hooked up. And Bill said, we got hooked up, and he couldn't put me down, but I had to let him win because he was going to break my arm. I mean, that's just, to me, that's just unbelievable.
Yeah, for no bigger than Bill is. That is Crazy.
Yeah. And they've told me before, after that, I heard people say that people are, for some reason, can be like that.
Yeah.
And anyway, that's kind of out of the rodeo story, but, you know. So, anyway. Well, did I ramble on too much?
No, we really enjoyed it, Jim.
There's a couple guys, Sean Davis. You ever get a hold of Sean and Bill Smith, and they could tell you some great stories. Sean's really good at storytelling. He's got all kinds of memory.
You'll have to send Jimbo their numbers. He'll call them up.
Yeah, I will.
We've been trying to get a hold of Bill Smith, actually, for a while.
Well, I got his number. Bill's not doing real good, but he, between him and his wife, Carol, Bill ended up being a great horseman after he quit riding. You know, he had a great. He studied with the great horseman. God name. You know, the man that started it all. Slipped my mind.
He's done everything. He's a great outfitter out there, great bronc rider, great horseman. Bill's quite the cowboy.
He's got some great stories.
You know who used to babysit me when I was a little kid?
He did?
No, not Bill, but this other guy did. His name was Buddy Heaton, an old rodeo clown. Did you ever know him?
Oh, you bet. You bet I did.
Yeah, he got out of prison and he moved in with my grandparents. Yeah. And for some reason, I don't know why, he became my babysitter there for about a year.
Oh, my God. Well, Mike Servey, he was the rodeo contractor. He used to be a clown, too, by the way, when he was a kid.
Really?
And he used to tell me, Buddy, because he traveled with Buddy a little bit, and he told me Buddy Heaton stories. Did you ever hear this one about Buddy Heaton?
I don't know. What is it?
Well, I happened to see some of it, and we were at Calgary.
This guy was
and
crazy.
And this was when Buddy was, I guess, pretty much retired, but he still was doing Calgary because he was, and like Clyde Van Voorhis, I guess you could go on and on about Buddy. I'd heard stories that were just unbelievable. And anyway, he had this buffalo.
Clyde.
And he had this,
His buffalo name was Clyde.
Is that right? You're kidding me.
No.
Anyway, I was watching him get on, and they had two guys holding that buffalo down. They said that buffalo hated him to get on. Anyway, he got on. He had this big buffalo coat and a big hat, a Ted Gallant hat, stovetop hat. And he had the biggest cigar I'd ever seen. And they said, and everybody said, this is going to be fun. You ought to see it. And at Calgary, they had this track in front of the grandstand, right where the rodeo part was. And they'd have these horse races, and a lot of really high-powered Canadian horses were in them. And after every event, they'd have a horse race. So I happened to see the last of this. So there the horse races started, and all of a sudden on the back stretch, about halfway down, there was Buddy treating that buffalo, over and under in that buffalo, with that cigar puffing. You could see the smoke come out. And then horses were coming around that back stretch, and Buddy was on the curve there and running the horse, and that's as far as I saw. But by the time they got to the finish line, Heaton had timed it to where the race horses and him hit the line the same time. And those horses saw that buffalo, and I guess it was the god-awfulest wreck you ever saw. They said it was horses. Some of them got lame for life, and anyway, they kicked Buddy out of Canada, and that was the last.
That was the day Buddy got kicked out of Canada, and they also put his buffalo down. The Mounties did.
Oh, did it?
Yeah,
really?
It really embarrassed the whole country of Canada. Buddy told me. He said that the Queen of England happened to be in attendance that day, and they were having this special horse race for her. It was about like the Kentucky Derby for the Canadians. And he said he jumped in there and he won the race and caused a bunch of trouble. And then all of a sudden, next thing he knew, they were escorting him and his buffalo out of Canada, but his buffalo never made it out.
I'll be darned. See, I hadn't heard that one. That part.
Yeah,
Isn't that something?
He got in all kind of trouble with that buffalo. He jumped it. He wasn't invited to President Kennedy's inauguration. He just went and jumped in there and went and made his buffalo bow in front of Kennedy, and they about shot him. Then he said he wasn't even allowed to be there, and he said President Kennedy told him he's all right. Go ahead and let him do his deal. And the worst one he ever told me, he said there was a strong man at a rodeo. And he was pulling this car loaded down with people, or a truck loaded down with people, with his mouth. And I don't even know why Buddy told me this. It sounded awful when I was a kid. He said he got in there and stepped on the brake and busted all this guy's teeth out. So,
I'd hear stories. Mike used to tell. I guess Buddy, when he was young, he said he was the darndest athlete he'd ever seen. He could do things that you just couldn't believe.
He had a lot of talent, but I think he liked being an outlaw more than anything.
Well, that's what I heard. And I remember seeing, I didn't know it was Buddy Keaton, but I remember seeing this one act that, and I think it was Buddy Keaton's act. You can tell me that he had this horse that had a sway back that was really, you know what I mean?
Yes, sir.
A real sway back, and you could put about 20 saddle blankets on it to make it come up to the withers. And he'd go in that arena, and I saw that act once or twice in Omaha, I think, or somewhere. I don't remember when I was young. And it was just amazing when he got them all off to see that horse.
Yeah, that was my babysitter.
Yeah, that explains a lot.
Yeah, that's why I'm lucky I didn't turn out worse than I did, Jimbo.
I know.
Well, I guess I don't know how he survived it, but I guess he had something.
Yeah, he lived it. Somehow he lived to a ripe old age and just died of old age, old Buddy Heaton.
Did a little time in prison, but that was just a little...
You know what he did? You know what he did to get thrown in prison, Jimbo?
You told me.
No.
So you remember back in the day when there were calling cards, you could bill it, to your home phone somehow with this calling card through your phone company. Well,
okay.
Buddy ends up with the IRS's, Internal Revenue Services, calling card. He's making calls all over the world, and he got caught doing it. They threw him in prison.
I'll be darned. I hadn't heard that one. That's good.
That's what he told me, so I don't know why I'd lie.
I can believe it. Knowing some of them stories I heard about it. I heard this one story that he'd go to when he have a rodeo, he'd go to the Cadillac dealer and get the convertible, and then he would jump his horse or buffalo over that convertible. But a lot of times, instead of jumping it, he just, for the fun of it, he just make that horse just jump right in the middle of that convertible Cadillac and pretty much tear the insides of it out. Just sadistic things like that.
Last dealings we ever had with Buddy, he was taking tack to horse sales and selling tack, brand new tack, and the tack guy that he was buying it from called us up one day and said, "You haven't seen old Buddy Heaton around, have you?" "No, sir, we haven't. Last few days." He said, "Well, he wrote me a crazy, like a $50,000 hot check." And we had a little bunkhouse out there, and a day or two later, we saw Buddy. He was out there messing around, and we walked into the bunkhouse, and from floor to ceiling was tack from old Harvey Miller's tack place. And we told Buddy he had to take his tack and get on out. We didn't want that kind of trouble. And he started his own horse sale there in town. In Hutchinson, Kansas is where it was. And he advertised in the paper, I still remember to this day, cheapest prices for buyers, highest prices for sellers, guaranteed.
Oh man.
But anyway, old buddy.
Yeah, that was a different era, and that must have been something.
Oh yeah. He
Did you? Yeah. Did you hear this one? You probably heard this. They were back in. I don't know who told me this one, but they were back at New York, and I don't know who was the star. I guess I don't know if it was Roy Rogers or Gene Autry, but they'd parade around, with their horse, and then at the last they would run in the middle of the arena, and he'd rear up, and the horse trigger or whatever would he'd pull his guns out and shoot in the air. And they say that one of those clowns, I don't know which one, let's say Buddy Heaton, and they talk about Casey Tibbs on this one a lot. They crawled up in the rafters with a bunch of dead pigeons. And when Roy Rogers jumps in the middle of that arena and raises up trigger and starts shooting with them huskies, they started throwing them pigeons down. And they said the crowd gets a booing, and there was one mad star. Just things like, things that you just can't imagine.
Right.
Yeah, one time I guess he was up in the rafters somewhere, and I guess he had a microphone on him somehow, and he was telling the announcer he was going to end his life and commit suicide, jump out of the rafters. It was either in Madison Square Garden or maybe Houston. And it went on for, I guess, a good while like this, and eventually he threw a dummy over the edge. And a lady in the stands had a heart attack because they thought Buddy Heaton was killing himself up there.
I know that. Oh my God!
At least that's what Buddy told me.
Yeah, I believe it.
I can believe it. That sounds like a Buddy Heaton. Oh Jesus! Oh.
Ooh, I don't know how we got off on Buddy Heaton. I just figured he might know him, so he might know a good Buddy Heaton story.
Yeah.
Well, I'd heard about him. I was enamored with the stories. Well, anyway, the rodeo business is evolving, and it's got quite a niche, I think. And it's a lot of TV stuff and radio stuff like you guys are doing.
Well, it looks like if you're a bronc rider these days, and you're a bronc rider of any kind, heck, a guy can actually make a pretty good living, it looks like, out there for a little while.
It does. They're getting there. They really are.
I know the expenses are high and stuff like that, but a lot of these guys, heck, they make good money on their sponsorships, and it's just good to see a cowboy be able to make a living cowboying these days and maybe have a little something when he's done, maybe.
You bet. It sure does. It's been very heartening.
We still like the old days, though, here at the Cowboys of the Old
I know. Yeah. Can you believe bucking horses? They cost over $100,000 now, Jimbo, for the good ones. Wow.
Isn't that amazing? Including these stock contracts, they didn't think it would work raising horses because in the 80s, it just all of a sudden there wasn't any. I actually didn't think they'd ever buck off another bronc rider in the 80s because it got so bad. And then all of a sudden, they've really done something with them. They've really done something.
They're raising some bad cats now. There's some guys that every horse they bring, a guy can win on. So,
right, it's really good watching. Yeah.
Well, Jim, we sure appreciate you coming on today and sharing some of your history with us and some of your stories about some of the guys you knew.
Well, it's been a pleasure. It's fun to do it. I'm one of the few ones left. That remembers a little bit of the 50s and the 60s.
Right.
But
well, this is a true history podcast, Jimbo, because this is the reason they went from the soft handholds to what they've evolved to now.
I know. And the style that they're using now.
Exactly.
Yeah, and you just don't think it can get any different, but it's hard telling.
No telling where it's going.
There's not very many guys that made the finals in the bareback riding and the steer wrestling.
Well, a world champion ruststock rider that made the timed event NFR. I can only think of two: Kenny McLean and him.
Ace Berry, he didn't win he never won any kind of
Phil
world
Line
championship.
never won a world championship in the ruststock.
But boy, howdy, he could have. He was a good hand too. Phil Line, he won all around, didn't he?
Yeah, he won all around, but he never did win individual world title in rough stock.
You didn't win the bull riding one
No.
year?
Won the average.
Ah, dang. Can't get nothing by you,
Yeah.
Jimbo.
No.
Well, all right, Jim. Appreciate you talking to us. And
Well, it's
Have a
been my
good one.
pleasure. It's
You bet,
fun to
man.
reminisce.
Yeah, well, you bet. Well, thanks for jumping on with us today. And keep in touch. And if you're ever down this way, look us up.
You bet. I sure will, and I'll get you those numbers, and we'll stay in touch, huh?
You bet. I would enjoy that.
hey, if
It's
you're ever
really
don't forget, if you're ever around Pawhuska, don't forget to stop by the Ben Johnson Cowboy Museum. Don't forget to go get you some turquoise jewelry over at the Buck and Flamingo, which now we're actually sharing it onto the Cowboys of the Osage podcast Facebook page now. Every Sunday night at 7 p.m. You can see how we
Okay.
make our living there selling turquoise jewelry and get you an Indian taco over here at the Saucy Calf when you're in town. So
you're wetting you're wetting my lips. I'm reading you. Thank you.
all right, Jim.
Jim, we'll see you later. Thanks a lot, man.
Yeah.
All
Have
right.
a good one.
We'll see everybody next week. This has been a good one.